Hi folks, this is International Master Kostya Kavutskiy, and today we'll be doing a lesson on how to prevent castling. So there are a few different ways to prevent castling, and I'll be showing you guys examples of all three ways. The first way is to use a sacrifice and bring the king out into the open, meaning force the king to move, so that the king, of course, will then forfeit its castling rights. The second way I'll show you is to attack one of the squares that the king has to move through. So in order to prevent castling that way by restricting the king's freedom to do so. And the third way to prevent castling, as we'll see, is to attack along the e-file and try to pin pieces to the enemy king so that the king cannot castle without losing material. So we'll be seeing examples of all three of those ways. In our first example here, this is a game that features a pretty well-known sacrifice. This is actually taking place in more than one game. Of course, this comes from the Ruy Lopez opening. And here with white to play, the very strong and winning sacrifice is knight takes f7. So this move, of course, forces the black king to take on f7, as otherwise black will be losing a lot of material. And after king takes f7, obviously black has forfeited the castling rights, but of course, what makes this a good move is not that black has given up the right to castle, but that white can continue and create a very strong attack with the move queen h5 check. Now, normally, just because you can give up a piece and prevent your opponent from castling doesn't mean that it's always going to be a winning sacrifice. You also need to have some kind of strong follow-up where you're able to get more pieces into the attack and find a way to create a strong attack against the king. Here, if black wants to hold on to his extra material, he has to play king e6. After a move like g6, for example, white plays queen takes d5 check, and will pick up the knight on e4, and white is winning the piece back, is going to be up 2 pawns, and black's king is going to continue to be unsafe. After a move like king e7, white again has a very strong attack after queen takes d5, and this knight is under attack, and if the knight moves away, white can throw in rook e1 check, bishop g5 might come into play. Basically, black's king is pretty hopeless here. So black played king e6, and this is kind of the critical response to white's play, defending the d5 pawn with the king, and for the moment keeping the position secure. And here white found a very, very strong way to continue the attack with the move knight c3. There are other strong moves, but I particularly like this one as it is incredibly forcing, as we'll see in the continuation. Now white is threatening to play queen takes d5, white is also threatening to take the knight. So essentially black is forced to capture on c3. And here's the point of white's play. He doesn't recapture, actually he throws in rook e1 check. Now at first it seems a little bit silly because black can block and retreat the knight from capture, so knight e4, and white has given up the second knight on c3. But here comes the winning move, rook takes e4. Another sacrifice that leads to a mating attack. After d takes e4, white plays bishop b3 check. d5 check is also leading to a winning position. And this is a forced mate in all the lines. For example, king e7, queen f7 check, king d6, queen d5. And white gets the second bishop into the attack. And after king e8, of course, we don't take the queen. Queen f7 is just made on the spot. So this was kind of the first method of preventing your opponent from castling. It's the most forcing method. And that is to sacrifice material in order to bring the king out in the open and force him to forfeit his castling rights. Our next example here is quite a famous game. I'm sure many of you have seen this game before. And this is one of Paul Morphy, the great American player, one of his most famous brilliancies. Here Paul Morphy is playing white, and in this position, black played the move b5, attacking the bishop and moving the pawn from b7 to b5 so that it is defended and that white isn't putting pressure on it with the queen from b3. So here Morphy unleashed a very powerful attack, starting with the sacrifice, knight takes b5. And the reason this move is included in this lecture is because this sacrifice doesn't necessarily bring the king out into the open and doesn't force the enemy king to move. But by playing very actively and sacrificing material and going for the attack, you'll see in this game black is never given any time to complete the development in castle. So this is actually a more common way of sacrificing in order to prevent your opponent from castling. C takes b5, bishop takes b5 check, and knight bd7. The reason this is more common is that there are a lot of games where one of the sides, either white or black, sacrifices material for the initiative, and because the enemy has to respond to threats, they are never given time to complete their development and castle. And if you haven't seen this game before, I'll quickly play through the rest of the attack. It's quite a beautiful game. White castled queenside, getting his king out of the center and bringing the rook into the attack, threatening to take the knight on d7 and force black to lose the queen. So black played rook d8, and here comes rook takes d7. Another very, very nice sacrifice. Black has to take with the rook in order to avoid losing the queen. Rook d1, white brings in the other rook. And after the move queen e6, trying to trade queens and develop, of course Morphy here found a very nice mate in 3 moves, starting with bishop takes d7 check, knight takes d7, and the brilliant queen b8 check, followed by the mate on d8. So of course a very famous example, I'm sure a lot of you have seen this game before, but I think it definitely pertains to the lecture in that it shows you that in order to prevent your opponent from castling, a lot of times if you're looking to sacrifice material, it's enough simply to create a strong attack and start creating threats. It's not totally necessary to get the king to move in order for them to forfeit the castling rights. A lot of times it's just enough to create enough threats so that your opponent has to react and doesn't get a chance to complete their development. Our next game is a more modern example. Here playing white is the very talented Grandmaster David Navarra, the Czech Republic, and playing black is another Grandmaster Parligras from Romania. So playing white here, there's a very obvious move that will prevent the opponent from castling, and that is the move bishop h6. Simply controlling the f8 square and physically preventing black from castling. This would, of course, be against the rules. But instead of doing this right away, Navarra first throws in the move e6. Black is basically forced to capture this pawn, and now he plays bishop h6. And white has a very strong threat here in bishop takes g6 check, followed by hg, and queen takes g6 would then be mate in that position. So if we ask ourselves, why did Navarra not play bishop h6 right away? Why did he throw in e6 first? Is because he wanted to create this mate threat. If he had started with bishop h6, black would most likely play knight c5, take the e6 square under control, and although black cannot castle kingside for the moment, he does have threats of capturing white's light squared bishop, developing the bishop to f5, queen d7, and black can consider castling queenside in that position, and is likely out of danger. So starting with e6 is a very strong idea. Black took. And here it was possible actually for white to sacrifice bishop takes g6. And after black recaptures, white takes, king f8. White can continue the attack and win some material with bishop h6 check. Black is forced to give up the exchange. And after queen h7 check, king f8, and a move like h4 for example, white has a pretty strong attack here. Threatening knight g5, the king is completely open, and black's pieces, as you can see, are fairly undeveloped and unable to participate in the defense. So this wouldn't necessarily have been a winning continuation, just a decent alternative to what happened in the game. Instead, Navarra plays a little bit more ambitiously. He plays bishop h6, and he wants to go for the kill with threatening the sacrifice. Black played bishop f6. This defends against bishop takes g6 because now the black king gets a escape square on e7 and black doesn't have to give back the material. And black would probably be okay here since he can bring the queen in to the defense next move. So instead, Navarra just plays the position as a pawn sacrifice. Of course, he sacrificed the e pawn by pushing to e6 earlier, and he simply castles queenside. So white's idea, of course, is that black's king is currently very, very restricted. He cannot castle kingside, and meanwhile, he's sitting on e8, kind of like a sitting duck, for white's rooks to come to the e-file and put massive pressure on the position. So this is kind of a modern example of how to play for the initiative against the king. You might have to sacrifice a pawn or two to prevent them from castling, and then you slowly build up your initiative. So let's see how the game continued. Queen e7 was played, rook e1, knight c5, and g4. The idea here is to play g5 and challenge the bishop on f6. Bishop d7, g5, bishop g7, bishop takes g6, and here Navarra goes for the sacrifice. All of his pieces are mobilized, and he's going to win a couple pawns for the piece in addition to exposing the black king. hg6 was played, queen takes g6, king f8, and rook takes d5, winning another pawn, putting pressure on the knight on c5, and it seems like white is very close to breaking through. All of his pieces are in fantastic attacking positions. Black played bishop takes h6, which I believe was the losing mistake, as this allows rook f5 check. Really nice tactic, using the pin along the e-file once again, and black was forced to give up the queen. E takes f5, rook takes e7, king takes e7, and after queen f6 check, white is winning even more material. The rook on h8 is going to be captured next move. And Navarra soon won this game, having not necessarily a big material advantage, but with such an active queen and very strong g-pawn, and black's rook on a8 not able to participate in the game, this of course is a completely winning position for white. Our next game here is another modern example, and this game is between two amazing, very, very strong players. Playing white here is Wesley So, the newly minted 2800 player and winner of the 2016 Grand Chess Tour. And playing black is, of course, the legend Garry Kasparov, the great world champion. So this took place in a Blitz exhibition match in the St. Louis event in 2016. And here Wesley So, playing white, has already sacrificed one pawn in order to get the initiative and get a development advantage. And here he sacrifices a second pawn with b4. Black captured, and now rook c1. And white's idea here is to create a ton of pressure along the c-file against black's queen. Black played knight ge7, and here comes the key move, queen b3. Notice this move doesn't take away any of black's castling squares, so black can still legally castle, but if black does choose to castle here, that sets up a very, very powerful discovered attack against the king on g8. So black can still legally castle, but this would be a very, very dangerous idea. For castles, for example, white can take the pawn on e5 with check, king h8, and white can win a lot of material here with knight takes c6, knight takes c6, and bishop b5. And white is simply going to pile on this poor knight on c6 that's pinned to the queen. Next is queen a4, knight d4. Black will not have enough to defend the knight, and white will be winning a piece here. So after queen b3, Wesley was able to win quite a brilliant attacking game. And if you want to see the rest of the game, you should check out the PGN provided for this lesson. Just wanted to include this example because it shows you that you don't always have to necessarily control one of the squares directly, f8 or g8, in order to prevent your opponent from castling. It's also enough to create such a threat where if your opponent does castle, they'll be walking into some kind of discovered attack, like so. Our last example here is another very, very famous game. Playing white is the first official world champion, Willem Steinitz. And this is one of his most famous games because it finished with quite a beautiful and astonishing combination. But I wanted to focus on this moment here, the point leading up to the combination, because it all started from this moment where white played the key move, rook e1. Quite a simple move, simply putting the rook on the open file. But by putting the rook on e1, white attacks the knight on e7, which means that black's king cannot castle without losing the defense of the knight. So this is another very, very common way of preventing your opponent from castling. If the king is forced to defend a piece, usually on e7 or sometimes on d7 when it's pinned along this diagonal, then the king is unable to castle without losing material. So black played the move f6 here. He was trying to control white's knight from jumping to e5 or g5. Queen e2, putting pressure on the e-file. Black retreated, queen d7. White played rook c1, bringing another piece into the game. c6. And here comes the start of a really, really brilliant play by Steinitz. He plays the move d5. Very nice pawn sacrifice, the point being that after c takes d5, he plays knight d4. And this knight was the last piece that white needed to activate in order to get a strong attack. Now the knight is coming to e6, where it's going to control so many important squares in black's position. The c7 square, the g7 square, and so on. And this knight will be a really, really powerful attacking force. Black played king f7, knight e6, rook hc8 was played. So as you can see, black is trying to castle by hand, meaning that he just brings his rook over, and given the chance, he would love to put the king on g8. But of course, Steinitz doesn't let him. He continues to play very, very actively and fights for the initiative. Queen g4 and g6. And here comes the brilliant combination I mentioned earlier. Started with the move knight g5 check. Discovered attack against the queen on d7. Black's only move is to play king to e8 in order to defend the queen. And the brilliant combination continues with the very, very fantastic sacrifice, rook takes e7. Now, we don't have time to go through the details of the sacrifice in today's lesson, but if you are interested, the details will be included in the PGN file provided with the game. So I would highly recommend, if you haven't seen this game before, to play through the variations. They are quite beautiful, and see how white won this game. But of course, for the purposes of our lesson, this is going a little bit too far. So I hope you guys found this instructive on how to prevent castling. To recap, the 3 different ways that are the most common is to 1. Sacrifice in order to either A. bring your enemy king out of the open, meaning it moved so it is not allowed to castle anymore, or to sacrifice material in order to create an attack that black must respond to, or I should say the opponent must respond to, and do not give them time to castle since you're creating too many threats. The second way is to physically control one of the castling squares to actually prevent your opponent from castling. And we saw that with 2 different examples. The first one was white controlling the f8 square with the bishop. The second one was more of an indirect example where Wesley So used this queen and knight to set up a discovered attack in the event that black did castle, which would of course lead to heavy material losses. And the third example was here in front of you, where by attacking a piece on the e-file, this prevents black's king from castling, as it would lose the defense of the knight on e7, and black would again lose material if they decided to castle. So I hope you guys found this lesson instructive, and until next time, this has been International Master Kostya Kavutskiy, and I'll see you next time. Take care.